Imagine this, it's the summer of 1942. Nazi Germany controls most of Europe. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-baked beaches of North Africa, the swastika flies over an empire that stretches thousands of miles. But deep in the shadows of this seemingly unstoppable war machine, a plan is taking shape. A plan so audacious, so carefully orchestrated, that if it had succeeded, you and I might be living in a very different world today. This isn't about the V2 rockets you've heard about. This isn't about the jet fighters or the wonder weapons that came too late. No, this is about Operation Felix, a secret military strategy that could have changed the entire course of World War II. A plan that would have closed the Mediterranean like a steel trap, starved Britain into submission, and potentially forced the Allies to their knees before America could fully mobilize its industrial might. The key to this plan? A single rock. A limestone fortress jutting out of the sea at the entrance to the Mediterranean. Its name? Gibraltar. And for 75 years, the full story of what almost happened there has remained hidden in classified documents, personal diaries, and the fading memories of those who were there. Today, we're going to uncover the truth about the secret Nazi plan that almost changed everything. Buckle up, because this is going to be one hell of a story. To understand why Hitler became obsessed with Gibraltar, we need to understand what this tiny piece of British territory actually meant to the war effort. And trust me, it was everything. Picture a map of Europe in your mind. Now focus on the southernmost tip of Spain. There, jutting out into the strait that separates Europe from Africa, is a massive limestone rock that rises 426 meters into the air. The Rock of Gibraltar. It's only about 6.8 square kilometers in size, smaller than most airports. But this tiny piece of land controlled something absolutely vital, the only entrance and exit between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. In 1940, as Nazi Germany was conquering Europe at a breathtaking pace, Gibraltar was Britain's last remaining foothold in southern Europe. But it was far more than just a symbolic presence. Gibraltar was a functioning military fortress, a naval base, and quite literally the cork in the bottle of the Mediterranean. Every single British convoy heading to Egypt, Palestine, or supplying the campaign in North Africa had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar. Every warship, every supply vessel, every troop transport, all of them squeezed through this narrow 14-kilometer-wide passage under the protective guns of Gibraltar. But here's what made Gibraltar absolutely critical. It wasn't just about controlling shipping. The rock itself had been transformed, over centuries, into one of the most fortified positions on Earth. The British had tunneled over 50 kilometers of passages through the limestone. Inside those tunnels were supply depots, hospitals, ammunition stores, barracks for thousands of troops, and most importantly, artillery positions that could fire on any ship attempting to pass through the strait. Admiral John Jackie Fisher, the first Sea Lord, once said, 5 minutes conversation with Gibraltar is worth 5 years at any university. What he meant was that whoever controlled Gibraltar controlled the Mediterranean. And in 1940, that was Britain, but only barely. Let me give you some context about just how precarious Britain's position was. By June 1940, France had fallen. The British had evacuated from Dunkirk. The Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway were all under Nazi occupation. In the Mediterranean, Italy had entered the war on Germany's side, giving the Axis powers a massive naval presence. Britain was alone. Completely and utterly alone. Winston Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister, was facing the very real possibility that Britain might have to surrender. The nation was preparing for a German invasion, Operation Sea Lion, and everyone from schoolchildren to grandmothers was drilling with whatever weapons they could find. In this desperate situation, Gibraltar became more than just strategically important. It became Britain's lifeline to its empire, to its oil supplies from the Middle East, and to any hope of maintaining a military presence in the Mediterranean. Now, put yourself in Hitler's shoes for a moment. You've just conquered France in 6 weeks, something that took 4 years of brutal warfare in World War I. Your armies seem unstoppable. Britain is on its knees, and the question everyone in the German High Command is asking is, how do we finish them off? Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, looked incredibly risky. The German navy was nowhere near strong enough to control the English Channel, and the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. A direct invasion could turn into a catastrophic defeat. But what if there was another way? What if, instead of invading Britain directly, you could strangle it? Cut off its supplies, isolate it from its empire, force it into submission through strategic strangulation rather than direct assault? And that's when Hitler's eyes turned to Gibraltar. That massive rock standing sentinel over the Mediterranean. If Germany could capture Gibraltar, the entire strategic situation would change overnight. Think about what would happen. The Mediterranean would become an Axis lake. British forces in Egypt would be cut off from resupply. Malta, that tiny island fortress that was causing so much trouble for Axis convoys to North Africa, would be isolated and would have to surrender. Rommel's Afrika Korps could be supplied without harassment. The Suez Canal could potentially be captured. The entire Middle Eastern oil fields would be threatened. And here's the kicker: Spain, which had remained neutral in the war, sat right next door to Gibraltar. Spain was ruled by General Francisco Franco, a fascist dictator who had just won the Spanish Civil War with significant help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Germans had sent the Condor Legion to support Franco. They had tested their tactics, their equipment, and their pilots in Spain. Franco owed them. If Hitler could convince Franco to let German troops march through Spain, they could attack Gibraltar from the land side, where its defenses were much weaker. The British had built Gibraltar to defend against naval assault. The landward defenses were substantial, but nothing like the gun emplacements facing the sea. This is where our story really begins. Because in July 1940, just as Britain was licking its wounds from Dunkirk and preparing for the Battle of Britain, a German military planning staff was already drawing up detailed plans for an operation that would be codenamed Felix. The objective? Capture Gibraltar, close the Mediterranean, and change the course of the war. Before we dive into the plan itself, we need to talk about one of the most enigmatic figures in Nazi Germany. A man whose role in this story, and in World War II as a whole, is still debated by historians today. His name was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and he was the head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. Canaris was a fascinating character. Born in 1887, he had been a naval officer during World War I, serving on submarines and cruisers. He was intelligent, cultured, spoke several languages fluently, and by all accounts was a master of the shadowy world of intelligence and espionage. But here's what makes Canaris so interesting. We now know that he was deeply opposed to Hitler and the Nazi regime. Not openly, he was far too intelligent for that, but secretly, he worked to undermine Hitler's more catastrophic plans. Some historians argue he was actively working with British intelligence. Others say he simply slow-walked operations he disagreed with. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. In the summer of 1940, Hitler tasked Canaris with conducting a reconnaissance mission to Spain. The official purpose was to assess Spain's readiness to enter the war and to evaluate the feasibility of capturing Gibraltar. But Canaris had his own agenda. On July 22, 1940, Canaris flew to Madrid. He brought with him a small team of Abwehr officers who were experts in various fields: artillery, engineering, naval operations. Their cover story was that they were touring Spain to observe military installations. The real mission was to scout Gibraltar and report back to Hitler on how it could be taken. Canaris met with Franco at the El Pardo Palace outside Madrid. The meeting didn't go as Hitler had hoped. Franco was slippery. He thanked Hitler for the support during the Spanish Civil War. He expressed admiration for German military prowess. He said all the right things about the new order in Europe. But when it came to actually committing Spain to enter the war, Franco had a long list of conditions. Spain was devastated from the civil war that had just ended in 1939. The country was broke. Infrastructure was destroyed. There were food shortages everywhere. Franco needed economic aid, military equipment, territory in North Africa, and more. He was essentially saying, "Sure, we'll join your war, but first pay up." Canaris reported this back to Berlin, but he also did something else. He toured the border between Spain and Gibraltar with his team, and he filed a detailed report about what taking Gibraltar would actually require. And here's where it gets interesting. Canaris's report, which was delivered to the German High Command in August 1940, painted a picture of enormous difficulty. He pointed out that Gibraltar's defenses were formidable. He noted that the British had plenty of warning time to bring in reinforcements. He highlighted the supply challenges of moving German forces across Spain. He even suggested that the British might sabotage the Spanish railway system to prevent German troops from reaching Gibraltar quickly. Was Canaris being realistic, or was he deliberately trying to make the operation look harder than it actually was? We'll probably never know for certain. But what we do know is that despite his pessimistic report, Hitler was still very interested. The operational planning was handed over to the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command. The man who would actually draw up the detailed military plan was General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations. Jodl was a different breed than Canaris. He was a loyal Nazi, a brilliant military planner, and he believed absolutely in the Führer's genius. If Hitler wanted Gibraltar, Jodl would figure out how to take it. Throughout August and September 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over England, Jodl's staff worked on Operation Felix. They studied maps, calculated supply requirements, analyzed British defensive positions, and wargamed different scenarios. The plan that emerged was actually quite brilliant, on paper at least. It called for a specialized assault force of German mountain troops and artillery, specifically trained for attacking fortified positions. These weren't ordinary infantry. These were the same elite units that had captured the supposedly impregnable Belgian fort of Eben-Emael in just 24 hours using gliders and shaped charges. The plan had several phases. Phase 1: Diplomatic. Secure Franco's agreement to allow German troops passage through Spain. This was absolutely critical. The entire operation depended on it. Phase 2: Infiltration. German units would move across Spain disguised as tourists or technical advisors. Heavy equipment would be sent by rail. The goal was to assemble a massive strike force near the Spanish-Gibraltar border without alerting the British. Phase 3: Assault Preparation. German artillery, including massive railway guns and siege artillery, would be positioned in the hills overlooking Gibraltar. These guns could fire shells weighing over a ton and could destroy fortifications from miles away. Phase 4: The assault itself. A massive artillery bombardment would begin, targeting Gibraltar's airfield, naval facilities, and known defensive positions. Under cover of this bombardment, German assault troops would attack across the narrow isthmus connecting Gibraltar to Spain. Phase 5: Exploitation. Once German forces had broken through the outer defenses, they would use flamethrowers, explosives, and even poison gas if necessary to clear the tunnel systems inside the rock. The British garrison would be given one chance to surrender before the final assault. The timeline Jodl proposed was aggressive: 10 days to move forces into position, 3 days of bombardment, and 7 days to complete the assault. Total, 3 weeks from start to finish. To support the operation, the Luftwaffe would provide air cover and bombing support. The German Navy would position U-boats at both ends of the strait to prevent British reinforcements from arriving by sea. And most intriguingly, the Italians would conduct a simultaneous operation to capture Malta, the other British fortress in the Mediterranean. On paper, it looked achievable. German forces had repeatedly demonstrated their ability to take supposedly impregnable fortifications. The Maginot Line was supposed to be invulnerable. German forces had simply gone around it. The Belgian forts were supposed to hold out for weeks. They fell in hours. Gibraltar, for all its imposing appearance, had never actually been tested in modern warfare. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. And they would all come to a head in a series of meetings between Hitler and Franco that would determine the fate of Operation Felix, and possibly the entire war. October 23, 1940. A train carrying Adolf Hitler pulls into the small French border town of Hendaye. Hitler has traveled all the way from Berlin for this meeting. He's coming fresh off his triumphal tour of conquered France, where he posed for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower and humiliated the French by making them sign their surrender in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler is at the peak of his power. He controls continental Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. The Wehrmacht seems invincible. Britain is isolated and under nightly bombardment from the Luftwaffe. The Soviet Union is still bound by the Nazi-Soviet Pact. America is still neutral. Everything is going Hitler's way. And today, he's going to meet with General Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator, to secure Spain's entry into the war and approve Operation Felix. Hitler is confident this will be a formality. After all, Germany helped Franco win the Spanish Civil War. Franco owes them. Plus, Hitler has a reputation as a masterful manipulator who can bend other leaders to his will through sheer force of personality. What Hitler doesn't know is that he's about to have one of the most frustrating meetings of his entire life. Franco arrives fashionably late, a subtle power move that already irritates Hitler. The two dictators greet each other with appropriate ceremony, and then they board Hitler's private train car for what Hitler expects to be a brief discussion. The meeting lasts for 9 hours. 9 hours. And by the end of it, Hitler would later tell Mussolini that he would rather have 3 or 4 teeth pulled than go through another meeting with Franco. So what happened in that railway car? Hitler opened with his standard approach, flattery mixed with appeals to shared ideology and barely veiled threats. He talked about the new order that was emerging in Europe. He painted a picture of Germany's inevitable victory over Britain. He spoke of the territories that Spain could gain, Gibraltar itself, French Morocco, perhaps even parts of Algeria. Franco listened politely. He agreed with Hitler's assessment of British weakness. He praised German military achievements. He expressed gratitude for German support during the Spanish Civil War. And then he started listing his conditions. First, Franco said, Spain needed massive economic aid. The country was barely feeding its population. There were bread lines in every city. The Civil War had destroyed factories, bridges, railways. Spain needed food, fuel, raw materials, industrial equipment. Could Germany provide this? Hitler, somewhat taken aback, said Germany could provide some assistance, but their own economy was strained by the war effort. He tried to move the conversation back to military matters. Franco nodded sympathetically and moved to his second point: territorial demands. Spain wanted not just Gibraltar, but also French Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and an expansion of Spanish Sahara. These were territories currently held by Vichy France, Germany's supposed ally. Hitler began to get frustrated. He needed to keep Vichy France cooperative. The French fleet was still powerful, and Hitler didn't want to push the French into joining the Allies. He couldn't just hand over French territory to Spain without consequences. Franco was unmoved. These territories, he insisted, were essential for Spanish security and prestige. If Germany couldn't guarantee them, then Spain's entry into the war would have to be reconsidered. Hitler tried a different approach. He appealed to Franco as a fellow fascist, as someone who understood the historical moment. Britain was finished. This was Spain's chance to join the winning side and share in the victory. If Spain waited too long, the war would be over, and Spain would get nothing. Franco agreed that Britain seemed weakened. But, he pointed out, Britain had not surrendered. The Royal Navy was still the most powerful navy in the world. Britain's empire was still intact. America was sending aid. Perhaps Britain was not quite as finished as it appeared. This went on for hours. Hitler would make a point, Franco would politely agree and then raise another obstacle. Hitler would offer a compromise, Franco would accept in principle but at another condition. It was like trying to nail jelly to a wall. At one point, Hitler brought up Operation Felix directly. The plans were drawn up. German troops were ready. All Spain had to do was allow them passage, and Gibraltar would fall in weeks. After Gibraltar, the Mediterranean would be closed, Britain would be starved, the war would be won. Franco stroked his mustache thoughtfully. This was certainly an interesting proposal. But there were concerns. What if the British Navy bombarded Spanish ports in retaliation? What if the Allies landed forces elsewhere in Spain? What if the operation failed? Spain was not ready for a major war. Perhaps next year, when Spain's economy had recovered? Hitler pressed harder. German military might was at Spain's disposal. The Luftwaffe would provide air cover. The Wehrmacht would do the fighting. All Spain had to do was say yes. Franco continued to demur. There were so many factors to consider. The Spanish people were war-weary. The economy was fragile. These French territories were really quite important. Perhaps if Germany could guarantee. By this point, Hitler was practically shouting. His interpreter later recalled that Hitler's voice was echoing through the train car. Hitler was red in the face, gesticulating wildly, alternating between threats and promises. Franco remained calm, speaking in a soft, measured voice, raising objection after objection. As the meeting stretched into its 7th, 8th, 9th hour, Hitler finally realized he wasn't going to get what he wanted. Franco was not going to commit to entering the war. Not today. Not without concessions that Hitler couldn't or wouldn't make. Finally, exhausted and furious, Hitler agreed to a vague protocol. Spain would enter the war. At a date to be determined later. The exact conditions would be negotiated further. Both sides would continue discussions. In other words, nothing was decided. Operation Felix was indefinitely postponed. Hitler left Henday in a rage. His staff knew better than to speak to him. He sat in his compartment, fuming, as the train carried him back toward Germany. Franco, meanwhile, returned to Madrid quite satisfied with himself. He had managed to avoid committing Spain to a war the country couldn't afford, while also not offending Hitler enough to provoke a German invasion of Spain itself. It was a masterclass in diplomatic obstruction. But here's the really interesting question: was Franco genuinely reluctant, or was this all theater? Some historians argue that Franco never had any intention of entering the war. He had seen what happened to countries that got involved in Hitler's plans. They became German satellites or battlefields. By endlessly negotiating, always asking for just a bit more, Franco kept Spain neutral while appearing to be a potential ally. Other historians point out that Franco was a committed fascist who genuinely admired Hitler and Mussolini. They argue that Spain's economic situation really was desperate, and Franco's demands were legitimate attempts to ensure Spain could actually fight if it entered the war. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. What we know for certain is that after Henday, Operation Felix was in serious trouble. Hitler tried several more times to revive the plan. He sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, to meet with Franco in February 1941. Ribbentrop was even less successful than Hitler had been. Franco sent him away with vague promises and no commitments. But Operation Felix wasn't dead yet. Hitler was not a man who gave up easily. Throughout the fall of 1940 and into 1941, the German High Command continued to refine the plan, hoping that Franco could somehow be brought around. What they didn't know was that the strategic situation was about to change in a way that would make Gibraltar less critical, or more critical than ever, depending on how you looked at it. As 1940 turned to 1941, the strategic picture of World War II was undergoing massive changes. And each of these changes affected the viability and importance of Operation Felix. First, the Battle of Britain had ended in a strategic defeat for Germany. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force or break British morale. Hitler had indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. This meant that the war in the West had reached a stalemate. Britain couldn't invade the continent, but Germany couldn't invade Britain. Both sides settled in for what looked like it would be a long war. And in a long war, strategic positions like Gibraltar became even more important. Second, the situation in North Africa was heating up. Mussolini's Italy had attacked British positions in Egypt in September 1940, and it had gone disastrously. The Italian 10th Army, despite outnumbering British forces by about 4-1, had been completely routed. By December 1940, the British had captured over 130,000 Italian prisoners and had advanced hundreds of miles into Libya. This was humiliating for the Axis powers. Hitler decided he had to bail out his Italian ally. In February 1941, he sent the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel to North Africa. This would develop into one of the most famous campaigns of the war, a back-and-forth struggle across the desert that would last until 1943. But here's the thing, Rommel's supply lines depended on convoys crossing the Mediterranean from Italy to North Africa. And those convoys were constantly harassed by British aircraft flying from Malta and by British ships operating from Gibraltar and Alexandria. If Germany had controlled Gibraltar, Rommel's supply problems would have been dramatically reduced. So from one perspective, the need for Operation Felix had become even more urgent. Gibraltar was the key to dominating the Mediterranean and supporting the North African campaign. But from another perspective, the deployment of German forces to North Africa meant that fewer troops were available for Operation Felix. The mountain divisions and specialized assault units that would have been used to attack Gibraltar were now spread across multiple theaters. Third, and this is the big one, Hitler was preparing for Operation Barbarossa. In December 1940, Hitler signed War Directive No. 21, which ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation was scheduled for May 1941, it would eventually be delayed to June. This was Hitler's ultimate goal, the conquest of Lebensraum in the East, the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism, and the capture of Soviet resources. Barbarossa would be the largest military operation in human history. Over 3 million German troops, along with hundreds of thousands of Allied Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The logistical requirements were staggering. Every unit committed to Barbarossa was a unit that couldn't be used for Operation Felix. Every tank, every artillery piece, every transport truck that was being positioned for the invasion of Russia was one less available for an attack on Gibraltar. Hitler faced a fundamental strategic choice: pursue the peripheral strategy of strangling Britain through control of the Mediterranean, or go for the throat with a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler chose Russia. And in doing so, he effectively killed Operation Felix. But here's where it gets interesting. The decision was not as clear-cut as it might seem. There were powerful voices in the German High Command who argued vehemently that Felix should take priority. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander of the German Navy, was the most vocal advocate for a Mediterranean strategy. Raeder understood naval warfare and strategic geography in a way that Hitler and most of his army-focused generals did not. Raeder argued that if Germany captured Gibraltar and Malta, and if they could convince Turkey to close the Dardanelles to Soviet shipping, the Mediterranean would become an Axis lake. Britain would be cut off from Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Middle Eastern oil fields. This would be strategically catastrophic for Britain, potentially enough to force them to negotiate a peace. Furthermore, Raeder pointed out, by controlling the Mediterranean and potentially driving through the Middle East, Germany could threaten the Soviet Union's southern flank. You could attack Russia from the south through the Caucasus, where the Soviet defenses were weaker and where the oil fields of Baku, the source of most of Soviet petroleum, were located. Raeder presented these arguments to Hitler multiple times throughout the winter of 1940 to 1941. He brought maps, casualty estimates, supply calculations. He tried to convince Hitler that the smart play was to finish off Britain before turning to Russia. Hitler listened politely and ignored him. Why? Several reasons. First, Hitler had a fundamental contempt for naval strategy. He was an army man. He understood tanks and infantry and artillery. Naval operations seemed slow and uncertain to him. He wanted the decisive land campaign that would destroy the enemy's army and capture their territory. Second, Hitler believed, and this was probably his biggest strategic error, that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. He thought the Russians were militarily incompetent, politically brittle, and that the entire communist system would implode as soon as the Wehrmacht kicked in the door. he famously said. "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. If Russia would fall in a few months anyway, why waste time on peripheral operations in the Mediterranean? Better to go for the big prize." Third, and this is more controversial, some historians argue that Hitler's decision was fundamentally ideological rather than strategic. His entire worldview was built around the conquest of the East, the destruction of communism, and the enslavement or extermination of the Slavic peoples. This was what he had written about in Mein Kampf. This was his life's mission. Gibraltar was just a rock. Russia was his destiny. Whatever the reasons, by early 1941, Operation Felix was effectively dead. The troops that would have been used for it were being redeployed to the east. The planning staff was reassigned. Franco continued to drag his feet on Spanish entry into the war. On April 20, 1941, Hitler's birthday, the last serious discussion of Operation Felix took place at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. Raeder made one final pitch for the Mediterranean strategy. Hitler thanked him for his input and changed the subject to Barbarossa. Operation Felix was filed away. The assault on Gibraltar would never happen. But, and here's the haunting question, what if it had? What if Hitler had listened to Raeder? What if Franco had been more cooperative? What if the mountain divisions had attacked Gibraltar in November 1940 instead of being held in reserve for Russia? Let's explore that alternative history. Now, I want to be clear, we're entering the realm of speculation here. This is alternate history, not actual history. But it's not wild speculation, we're going to base this on realistic assessments of what actually could have happened if Operation Felix had been executed in late 1940 or early 1941. So let's imagine, it's November 1940. Franco, for whatever reason, maybe Hitler offers him better terms, maybe German bribes reach the right people, maybe Franco just miscalculates, agrees to let German troops transit through Spain. Within 2 weeks, German mountain divisions, artillery units, and Luftwaffe squadrons begin moving across Spain by rail and road. The British are aware something is happening. You can't move thousands of troops without being noticed, but they're unsure of the exact target and timeline. By late November, German forces are in position in the hills overlooking Gibraltar. Massive siege guns, including the infamous 800mm Schwerer Gustav railway gun that could fire a 7-ton shell, are set up. The Luftwaffe has established forward airfields in southern Spain. December 1, 1940, Operation Felix begins. The assault opens with a massive artillery bombardment. Hundreds of guns, from small field artillery to massive siege guns, open fire on Gibraltar. The target priorities are the airfield, the naval facilities, and the known gun emplacements on the rock. The British garrison, commanded by General Lord Gort, who had commanded the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, had known this was a possibility and had prepared as best they could. But the sheer intensity of the bombardment is overwhelming. Within the first 24 hours, Gibraltar's small airfield is cratered and unusable. The Royal Air Force fighters stationed there have to evacuate to North Africa or be destroyed on the ground. Several British ships in the harbor are damaged by shell fire. Parts of the town of Gibraltar are in flames. But the rock itself, the fortress, remains largely intact. The British have 16-inch naval guns mounted in tunnels that can be rolled out, fired, and rolled back before German counter-battery fire can hit them. They also have the advantage of height. Their observers can see German positions that are invisible from below. The bombardment continues for 72 hours. Then, under cover of darkness and smoke, German assault troops move forward across the narrow isthmus that connects Gibraltar to Spain. This is where they run into the first serious problem. The British have had months to prepare defenses in depth. There are minefields, barbed wire entanglements, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, and pre-registered artillery zones. The German mountain troops are excellent soldiers, but they're attacking into a prepared defensive position with no room for maneuver. The first assault waves take heavy casualties. German engineers use Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire. Flamethrower teams try to clear the pillboxes. Step by step, taking horrific losses, the German troops fight their way forward. By December 5th, German forces have breached the outer defenses and are at the base of the rock itself. This is where the real nightmare begins. Gibraltar is not like a normal fortress. You can't surround it. You can't starve it out quickly. It has massive stockpiles of food and ammunition in the tunnels. You can't really bombard it effectively because the entire fortress is inside solid rock. The British have 16,000 troops inside Gibraltar, plus thousands of civilians who have taken refuge in the tunnels. They have ammunition for months. They have water from desalination plants and underground springs. They have hospitals, communication centers, and command posts all deep underground. The German assault troops are faced with fighting their way into tunnel systems that are designed to be defended. Every corridor is a killing zone. The British have steel doors that can seal off sections. They have machine gun positions that cover every approach. They have stocks of hand grenades, explosives, and, if things get truly desperate, poison gas. The fighting inside the tunnels becomes a nightmare of close combat in the dark. German flamethrower teams try to clear British positions. British defenders roll grenades down staircases. Both sides take terrible casualties. Days turn into weeks. By Christmas 1940, German forces control the town of Gibraltar and the lower slopes of the rock, but the main fortress is still holding out. German casualties are mounting, perhaps 5,000 dead and wounded already. The British have lost around 3,000, but they're still fighting. Hitler is growing impatient. The operation was supposed to take 3 weeks. It's now been nearly a month. He orders more troops sent forward. He authorizes the use of chemical weapons if necessary. But there's a bigger problem developing. The Royal Navy is counterattacking. Force H, the powerful British naval squadron based at Gibraltar, had evacuated to sea when the German assault began. Now they're bombarding German positions from offshore. British battleships and cruisers are firing their main guns at German artillery positions, supply dumps, and troop concentrations in southern Spain. The Germans can't effectively respond. Their air force is focused on supporting the ground assault. Their few U-boats in the area can't get close to the British battleships, which are protected by destroyers and operating in waters they know intimately. Moreover, the British Mediterranean fleet from Alexandria is also on the move. They're escorting convoys carrying reinforcements, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and South African troops, toward Gibraltar. By early January 1941, a British relief force of 40,000 troops is approaching. If they can land on the coast of Spain, away from German positions, they could attack the German siege forces from behind. Hitler faces a critical decision: commit even more forces to Spain, turning Operation Felix into a major campaign, or cut his losses. But events make the decision for him. On January 10, 1941, British forces break out from their positions inside Gibraltar in a sudden counterattack. Fresh troops who have been held in reserve, combined with a massive naval bombardment that catches German forces during a rotation, drive the Germans back from the lower slopes of the rock. Simultaneously, the British relief force lands at Tarifa, west of Gibraltar, threatening to cut off the German forces. Franco, seeing Spanish territory becoming a battlefield and fearing a British invasion of Spain, suddenly announces that Spain is reaffirming its neutrality and demands that all foreign forces withdraw from Spanish soil. This is a disaster for Hitler. He could order his forces to occupy Spain by force, but that would tie down hundreds of thousands of troops in a country with a hostile population and terrible logistics. It would also potentially push Franco into the Allied camp. Furious, Hitler orders a withdrawal. By February 1, 1941, the last German troops have evacuated Spain. Operation Felix has failed, at a cost of perhaps 15,000 German casualties. But, and this is the critical point, even though Felix failed in this scenario, it has changed the strategic situation dramatically. First, those 15,000 German casualties, plus the dozens of ships lost to British naval action and the hundreds of aircraft destroyed, represent a significant drain on German military power. More importantly, those troops, ships, and aircraft are no longer available for Operation Barbarossa. Second, the 3-month campaign has delayed Barbarossa. Instead of launching in June 1941 as historically happened, the invasion of the Soviet Union now has to wait until July or even August to allow forces to be redeployed from Spain. Third, the relationship between Germany and Spain is poisoned. Franco feels betrayed that Hitler dragged Spain into a conflict that became a disaster. Spanish neutrality, which was somewhat favorable to Germany historically, is now tilted toward the Allies. Fourth, British morale has received a massive boost. Instead of an endless string of defeats, Britain has won a significant defensive victory. Churchill can point to Gibraltar and say, "See? The Nazi war machine can be defeated. We can win this." But most importantly, the delay to Operation Barbarossa could be catastrophic for Germany. In real history, the invasion of Russia in June 1941 came perilously close to succeeding. German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow by December, but were stopped by the Russian winter and Soviet reinforcements from Siberia. If Barbarossa is delayed by 2 months, it means German forces reach Moscow's outskirts in February 1942 instead of December 1941. By that point, the Soviets have had more time to evacuate their industries eastward, to mobilize reserves, and to prepare defenses. The German forces, meanwhile, are fighting through a Russian winter without proper preparation. The result could be that Operation Barbarossa fails not in December 1941, but much earlier. Germany might never get close to Moscow. The entire Eastern Front could stabilize hundreds of miles further west. And if that happens? If Germany is bogged down in Russia without having knocked out the Soviet Union quickly? Then the war becomes a protracted struggle of attrition, exactly the kind of war Germany cannot win. So paradoxically, if Operation Felix had been attempted and failed, it might have actually shortened the war and saved millions of lives by crippling Operation Barbarossa before it could develop into the apocalyptic struggle that consumed the Eastern Front for 4 years. But what if Felix had succeeded? What if, against all odds, Gibraltar had fallen? Let's imagine a different scenario. The German assault is better prepared. They use the specialized tactics they developed for ebb and email. They bring in assault troops trained specifically for tunnel fighting. They seal off sections of the rock with explosives and flooding. They use psychological warfare, threatening to execute civilian hostages, promising safe passage for surrendering troops. By January 15, 1941, after 6 weeks of brutal fighting, the British garrison commander realizes the situation is hopeless. With ammunition running low, water supplies threatened, and thousands of civilian refugees in the tunnels facing starvation, he requests terms for surrender. Hitler, desperate for a victory he can publicize, offers generous terms. British troops will be allowed to evacuate as prisoners of war with honor. Civilians will be repatriated. In exchange, the fortress is surrendered intact. On January 20, 1941, the Union Jack comes down from Gibraltar for the first time in over 200 years. The swastika rises in its place. Now what happens? The immediate consequences are dramatic. The Strait of Gibraltar is closed to Allied shipping. British convoys can no longer use the Mediterranean route to Egypt and the Suez Canal. All supplies have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles and weeks to every journey. Malta becomes untenable. Cut off from resupply from both Gibraltar and Egypt, the island fortress has to be evacuated by April 1941. With Malta gone, Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa can be supplied without harassment. By May 1941, with unlimited supplies and reinforcements, Rommel launches a major offensive in North Africa. Without the constant drain of supplies being sunk in the Mediterranean, he has 3 times as many tanks, unlimited fuel, and fresh divisions. By July 1941, Rommel has captured Alexandria and the Suez Canal. British forces in Egypt are retreating into Palestine. The Middle Eastern oil fields are threatened. But here's where Hitler faces his biggest decision yet. Does he continue the Mediterranean strategy, driving through the Middle East toward the Soviet Union's southern flank? Or does he still launch Operation Barbarossa? If Hitler continues the Mediterranean strategy, German forces drive through Palestine, Syria, and Iraq in late 1941 and early 1942. They reach the oil fields of Persia and threaten the southern borders of the Soviet Union. Turkey, seeing which way the wind is blowing, might allow German troops transit to attack the Soviet Caucasus from the south. In this scenario, Operation Barbarossa might never happen, or it might be launched as a supporting operation to a main thrust through the Middle East. The entire character of the Eastern Front would be different. Alternatively, if Hitler still invades Russia in June 1941, he does so with the Mediterranean secured and British forces in complete disarray. Britain would be forced to negotiate, probably not a surrender, but perhaps a ceasefire that acknowledges German control of continental Europe in exchange for Britain keeping its empire. With Britain neutralized or out of the war, Germany could focus entirely on the Soviet Union. No Mediterranean theater drawing away resources. No bombing campaign over Germany forcing the deployment of air defense fighters. All of Germany's military might focus on a single enemy. The Soviet Union would still be an incredibly tough opponent. They had massive manpower reserves, a growing industrial base in the Urals and Siberia, and the advantage of fighting on their own territory. But without British, and eventually American, aid, without the threat of a second front in the West, could the Soviets have held out? It's impossible to say for certain. What we can say is that the strategic situation would have been completely different. The war that actually happened, with the Allies fighting in North Africa, Italy, and France while the Soviets ground down the Wehrmacht in the East, might never have occurred. Instead, we might have seen a years-long struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union, with no Western front to divert German forces. We might have seen German forces reaching the Ural Mountains, cutting the Soviet Union in half. We might have seen the development of atomic weapons by Germany before the Americans could complete theirs. Or we might have seen the Soviet Union, even alone, grinding down the Wehrmacht through sheer attrition, retaking their territory, and then pushing into Eastern Europe without any Western allies to meet them. The point is this: Gibraltar was not just a rock. It was a strategic linchpin. Its capture or continued defense could have altered the entire course of World War II. And Operation Felix, the secret Nazi plan that almost happened, could have changed everything. But it didn't happen. And to understand why, to understand what really killed Operation Felix, we need to look at the final chapter of this story. So we've covered what Operation Felix was, what it could have achieved, and what might have happened if it had succeeded or failed. Now let's talk about why, in actual history, it never happened at all. The conventional explanation, the one you'll find in most history books, is simple: Franco said no. Hitler couldn't convince the Spanish dictator to cooperate, so the operation was impossible. That's true, as far as it goes. But it's not the whole story. Because even if Franco had said yes, there were fundamental problems with Operation Felix that might have doomed it anyway. Problem 1. The Spanish infrastructure. Spain in 1940 was an economic disaster. The Spanish Civil War had destroyed much of the country's infrastructure. Railways were damaged, bridges were blown up, roads were cratered. Moving a modern mechanized army across Spain would have been a logistical nightmare. General Wilhelm von Thoma, who had commanded the German Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, filed a report about this. He pointed out that the Spanish railway network couldn't handle the weight of German heavy equipment. Bridges would need to be reinforced. Track gauges were different in some areas. Tunnels were too small for some German equipment. Moving an assault force to Gibraltar would require months of preparation and repair work on Spanish infrastructure. And all of that work would be visible to British reconnaissance. There would be no strategic surprise. Problem 2. The Strait of Gibraltar. Here's something that often gets overlooked. Gibraltar itself might be on the European side of the strait, but the strait is only 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That means if you're standing in Gibraltar with binoculars, you can see Spanish Morocco on the African side. If Germany captured Gibraltar, what would stop the British from simply establishing new bases in Morocco? The Free French controlled parts of North Africa. The British had forces in Egypt. They could potentially land forces in Morocco and simply shell Gibraltar from the African side. In fact, the British had already considered this. They had plans to evacuate Gibraltar and establish alternative bases in Tangier or Casablanca if Gibraltar fell. The strait could still be controlled from the African side. For Operation Felix to truly succeed, Germany would need to control both sides of the strait. That would mean occupying Spanish Morocco, another major military operation requiring Franco's cooperation and tying down more German forces. Problem 3. The Royal Navy. German planning for Operation Felix consistently underestimated the power of the Royal Navy. The Germans were an army-focused military. They thought in terms of land operations. But Gibraltar was fundamentally a naval position. Even if German forces captured the rock itself, they would then have to hold it against the full might of the Royal Navy. British battleships could bombard German positions with impunity. British submarines could interdict supply lines. British aircraft carriers could launch airstrikes. The German Navy in 1940 was nowhere near strong enough to contest control of the waters around Gibraltar. The Kriegsmarine had a handful of battleships and cruisers, and most of those were needed to threaten Atlantic convoys. The German submarine force was still relatively small. Admiral Raeder understood this, which is why he advocated for securing Gibraltar as part of a comprehensive Mediterranean strategy, including neutralizing the French fleet, capturing Malta, and coordinating with the Italian Navy. But Hitler never fully committed to this vision. Problem 4. Air power. The Luftwaffe would have had to provide air cover for Operation Felix from bases in Spain. But in 1940 to 1941, the Luftwaffe was already stretched thin. They were conducting bombing campaigns against Britain, supporting operations in North Africa, and preparing for Barbarossa. Moreover, Gibraltar had the advantage of proximity to British airfields in North Africa. The RAF could operate fighters from Morocco and Algeria. The distance from these bases to Gibraltar was shorter than from most German bases in Spain. The air battle over Gibraltar could easily have turned into another Battle of Britain, a prolonged campaign of attrition that the Luftwaffe couldn't afford. Problem 5. Spanish reliability. Even if Franco had initially agreed to Operation Felix, there was no guarantee Spain would stay the course. The Spanish military was weak, disorganized, and poorly equipped. If the operation went badly, if British forces landed elsewhere in Spain, if Spanish cities came under naval bombardment, Franco might have changed his mind and demanded German withdrawal. Germany would have been conducting a major military operation with a line of communication running through a neutral country led by an unpredictable dictator. This was a strategic nightmare. Problem 6. Timing. Operation Felix could only be conducted during certain times of the year. The winter weather in southern Spain can be quite bad: storms, heavy rain, rough seas. Summer would be better, but that would mean waiting until mid-1941. By mid-1941, Hitler was committed to Barbarossa. The troops were deployed, the plans were made, the diplomatic preparation with Romania and Finland was complete. Delaying Barbarossa to pursue Felix would have meant attacking Russia even later in the year, possibly not until 1942. And Hitler was convinced that Barbarossa had to happen in 1941. He believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Soviet Union was planning to attack Germany, and that preempting this attack was crucial. Every month of delay made Barbarossa riskier in Hitler's mind. Problem 7. The real strategic situation. Here's the harsh truth that German planners didn't want to admit: capturing Gibraltar wouldn't actually win the war. Yes, it would close the Mediterranean to British convoys. Yes, it would improve Rommel's supply situation in North Africa. Yes, it would be a propaganda victory and a strategic blow to Britain. But Britain would still control the Atlantic. The Royal Navy would still be the dominant naval power. Britain would still have access to American supplies and to the resources of its empire via alternative routes. The British Isles would still be an unsinkable aircraft carrier threatening German-occupied Europe. Capturing Gibraltar might force Britain to fight more defensively, but it wouldn't force Britain to surrender. Churchill had made it clear that Britain would fight on no matter what. Even if the Mediterranean was lost, even if Egypt fell, Britain would continue fighting. The only way to truly defeat Britain was either to invade the British Isles directly, which was nearly impossible with the Royal Navy intact, or to starve Britain through an unlimited submarine campaign in the Atlantic, which the German Navy wasn't strong enough to execute. Gibraltar was important, but it wasn't decisive. And Hitler, for all his strategic mistakes, seems to have recognized this at some level. The real reason: Hitler's priorities. So we come to the fundamental reason Operation Felix never happened. Hitler didn't really want it to happen. Oh, he was interested in the concept. He liked the idea of capturing Gibraltar. He authorized planning. He met with Franco. But when push came to shove, when it became clear that Felix would require significant resources and delay his primary goal, the destruction of the Soviet Union, Hitler chose Russia. Hitler's entire worldview was oriented eastward. He believed in Lebensraum, living space for the German people in the East. He believed the Soviet Union was a mortal threat that had to be destroyed. He believed that conquering Russia would give Germany the resources, the space, and the security to dominate Europe permanently. Mediterranean adventures, in Hitler's mind, were distractions from the main event. They were the kind of peripheral strategies that armies got bogged down in while missing the opportunity for decisive victory. He was wrong, of course. But that's what he believed. And because he believed it, Operation Felix was always going to be secondary to Operation Barbarossa. There's a bitter irony here. If Hitler had pursued the Mediterranean strategy that Raeder advocated, if he had captured Gibraltar and Malta, driven through the Middle East, secured the oil fields, and only then turned to attack the Soviet Union from the south, he might have had a better chance of winning the war. Instead, he launched a premature invasion of the Soviet Union that eventually destroyed the Wehrmacht and led to Germany's total defeat. The secret Nazi plan that could have changed World War II forever was killed not by Franco's obstruction, not by British defenses, not by logistical impossibilities, but by Hitler's own strategic obsessions. So what actually happened after Operation Felix was shelved? How did the war develop without this dramatic gambit? As we know, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union became the largest and bloodiest military campaign in human history. Over 4 years, the Eastern Front consumed millions of lives and ultimately broke the back of the Wehrmacht. Gibraltar remained in British hands throughout the war. It continued to serve as a crucial base for Allied operations in the Mediterranean. When the Allies invaded North Africa in Operation Torch in November 1942, Gibraltar was the staging point. When they invaded Sicily and Italy in 1943, convoys assembled at Gibraltar. The Rock remained the key to the Mediterranean, right up until the end of the war. Spain, under Franco, maintained its neutrality, officially at least. In reality, Franco's regime was quietly helpful to Germany in various ways. Spain allowed German submarines to refuel in Spanish ports. Spanish workers went to Germany to support the war industry. The Blue Division, a unit of Spanish volunteers, fought alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. But Spain never formally entered the war. Franco had successfully walked the tightrope, appearing friendly to the Axis while avoiding the disasters that befell Germany's actual allies. After the war, Franco faced calls from the victorious Allies to step down. The United States and Britain considered Spain a fascist regime that had no place in the post-war order. Spain was excluded from the United Nations and faced diplomatic isolation. But Franco survived. The Cold War saved him. As tensions between the West and the Soviet Union escalated, Spain's strategic position became valuable again. The United States decided that an anti-communist dictator in Spain was preferable to the chaos that might follow Franco's fall. By the 1950s, Spain was receiving American aid and hosting American military bases. Franco remained in power until his death in 1975, having outlasted Hitler, Mussolini, and all the other fascist leaders of his generation. He left behind a complicated legacy, a man who had helped precipitate the Spanish Civil War, who had collaborated with the Nazis, but who had also kept Spain out of World War II. As for the German officers involved in planning Operation Felix, their fates varied. Admiral Canaris, the enigmatic intelligence chief who had conducted the initial reconnaissance of Gibraltar, continued his secret opposition to Hitler. In 1944, after the failed July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler, Canaris was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed in April 1945, just days before the war ended. Many historians now believe Canaris had been covertly sabotaging Nazi operations for years. His pessimistic reports about Gibraltar, his slow walking of various plans, his mysterious connections to Allied intelligence, they all suggest a man working from within to undermine the regime he served. We'll probably never know the full truth, but Canaris remains one of the most intriguing figures of the war. Admiral Raeder, who had advocated so strongly for the Mediterranean strategy, continued to command the German Navy until 1943, when disagreements with Hitler over naval strategy led to his replacement. After the war, he was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes, and sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 1955 due to poor health, and died in 1960. General Jodl, who had done the actual operational planning for Felix, remained Hitler's chief of operations throughout the war. He was one of the few officers present in the bunker when Hitler committed suicide in April 1945. Jodl signed the German instrument of surrender on May 7, 1945. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and hanged in October 1946. The men who had planned Operation Felix had envisioned a short, victorious campaign that would change the course of the war. Instead, they presided over Germany's total defeat and destruction. The historical debate. In the decades since World War II, historians have endlessly debated the question, could Operation Felix have succeeded? And if it had, would it have changed the outcome of the war? Some historians, like British military historian John Keegan, argue that Felix was a fantasy from the start. They point out the logistical difficulties, the Spanish infrastructure problems, and the power of the Royal Navy. In this view, even if Germany had captured Gibraltar, it wouldn't have been decisive. Other historians, like American strategist Edward Luttwak, argue that Hitler made a catastrophic error by prioritizing Barbarossa over Mediterranean operations. They believe that a comprehensive strategy focused on closing the Mediterranean, capturing the Middle Eastern oil fields, and only then attacking Russia might have given Germany a real chance at victory. Still others, like German historian Klaus Reinhardt, argue that the entire debate is moot because Franco was never going to cooperate. The political and diplomatic obstacles were insurmountable regardless of the military feasibility. My own view, for what it's worth, is that Operation Felix represents a road not taken, one of those pivotal moments where history could have gone in a different direction. Would it have changed the ultimate outcome? Probably not. The fundamental strategic realities, American industrial power, Soviet manpower, British determination, would likely have led to Allied victory eventually. But the path to that victory could have been very different. The war might have lasted longer. The casualties might have been higher or lower. The post-war world might have looked different. That's what makes Operation Felix so fascinating. It's a glimpse into a world that almost was. Gibraltar today. Today, Gibraltar remains a British overseas territory, though Spain continues to claim sovereignty over it. The Rock is still a functioning port and military base, though its strategic importance is far less than during World War II. You can visit the tunnels that the British dug during the war. You can see the gun emplacements that would have defended against Operation Felix. You can stand at the southernmost tip of Europe and look across the strait to Africa, just as countless soldiers, sailors, and planners did during those crucial years. The town of Gibraltar is a curious mix of British and Mediterranean culture. You'll find fish and chips shops next to tapas bars. Red telephone boxes stand on sun-drenched streets. The famous Barbary macaques, the only wild monkeys in Europe, still roam the Upper Rock, just as they did when German officers studied the fortress through binoculars in 1940. There's a legend that says Britain will retain Gibraltar as long as the macaques remain on the rock. During World War II, when the macaque population dwindled to just 7 individuals, Churchill himself ordered that more monkeys be brought in to maintain the population. He was a superstitious man in some ways, and he wasn't taking any chances. The macaques are still there. So is Gibraltar. So is that fascinating, what if, question that historians will debate for generations to come. Lessons for today. What can we learn from the story of Operation Felix? What does this secret Nazi plan that never happened tell us about strategy, leadership, and the nature of war? First, it reminds us that strategy is about choices. Hitler had to choose between the Mediterranean strategy and the invasion of Russia. He chose Russia, and that choice doomed Nazi Germany. The lesson: even when you have the most powerful military in the world, you can't do everything. You have to prioritize, and your priorities matter more than your capabilities. Second, it shows the importance of allies and diplomacy. Germany's inability to bring Spain into the war, Franco's skillful obstruction, prevented Operation Felix from happening. Military power alone isn't enough. You need diplomatic skill, the ability to build coalitions, and reliable partners. Third, it demonstrates that geography matters. Gibraltar's position gave it an importance far beyond its physical size. Small pieces of terrain, a rock, a bridge, a mountain pass, can have strategic significance out of all proportion to their size. Understanding geography is fundamental to understanding strategy. Fourth, it highlights the danger of ideological obsession overriding strategic logic. Hitler's fixation on destroying the Soviet Union prevented him from pursuing strategies that might have actually won the war. When ideology drives strategy rather than strategic reality driving decisions, disasters follow. Finally, it reminds us that history is contingent. It's not inevitable. Small decisions, made by individual people, can have enormous consequences. If Franco had said yes instead of no, if Canaris had been more encouraging instead of more pessimistic, if Hitler had listened to Raeder instead of dismissing him, the world might be a very different place. That's both humbling and empowering. It means we can't take the current world for granted. It means the choices we make, individually and collectively, matter. It means history is still being written, every day, by the decisions of leaders and ordinary people alike. So there you have it, the secret Nazi plan that almost changed World War II forever. Operation Felix, the plan to capture Gibraltar, close the Mediterranean, and strangle Britain into submission. A plan that was meticulously prepared, seriously considered at the highest levels of Nazi leadership, and ultimately abandoned in favor of the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union. We've covered a lot of ground in this video. We've explored why Gibraltar was so strategically important. We've met the fascinating characters involved in planning Felix, from the enigmatic Admiral Canaris to the stubborn Francisco Franco. We've examined the famous Hendaye meeting where Hitler tried and failed to bring Spain into the war. We've wargamed what might have happened if Felix had been attempted. And we've analyzed why, ultimately, this secret plan never became reality. The story of Operation Felix reminds us that World War II, despite how thoroughly it's been studied, still contains surprises, still has stories that aren't widely known, still offers insights into the nature of war and strategy. It also reminds us of something crucial: history is made up of decisions. Hitler's decision to prioritize Barbarossa over Mediterranean operations. Franco's decision to keep Spain neutral. Churchill's decision to hold Gibraltar at all costs. Each of these decisions, made by individual human beings under enormous pressure, shaped the world we live in today. In an alternate timeline, one where different decisions were made, you and I might not be here having this conversation. The world might look completely different. That's the strange power of these historical what-ifs. They remind us that nothing was inevitable, that everything could have been different. I find something oddly comforting in that. It means history isn't just a list of facts and dates to memorize. It's a story of human choices, human errors, human triumphs, and human tragedies. It's a story that continues today, with us as the characters making the choices that will shape tomorrow's history. Operation Felix never happened. Those German mountain troops never assaulted the Rock of Gibraltar. The swastika never flew over that ancient fortress. But in the planning documents, the reconnaissance reports, the diplomatic cables, and the fading memories of those who were there, the ghost of Operation Felix remains, a reminder of the war that might have been. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating what-ifs, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We put an enormous amount of research into these videos, and your support makes them possible. Drop a comment below and let me know, do you think Operation Felix could have succeeded? Would capturing Gibraltar have changed the outcome of the war? And what other secret plans or operations from World War II would you like to see covered? There are so many incredible stories from this period of history, stories of courage and cowardice, brilliance and stupidity, triumph and tragedy. Stories that can teach us something about human nature and the world we live in today. If you want to learn more about World War II strategy, I've got a whole playlist dedicated to the topic. I'll put a link in the description and in the cards above. We've covered everything from Hitler's strategic mistakes to Churchill's greatest decisions, from the Battle of Midway to the fall of Berlin. I also want to thank our Patreon supporters who make content like this possible. Creating a 90-minute deep dive video with this level of research and detail takes weeks of work. Your support allows us to keep making these videos without cutting corners or sacrificing quality. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link in the description. Show Patreon supporter credits scrolling. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got to where we are, and maybe, just maybe, making better decisions about where we're going next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.